After age 50, your brain naturally starts to slow down. Memory slips, focus fades, and even small tasks can feel overwhelming. But what if your breakfast could fight back? Could the food you eat each morning actually protect your brain and prevent cognitive decline? According to a study from Rush University, seniors who followed a brain-healthy diet reduced their risk of Alzheimer's by over 50%. That's not a small change. That's life-changing. Welcome to Seniors Over 50, where we help you eat well, live well, and age strong. Today, we're exploring 8 powerful breakfast ideas that support brain health, sharpen memory, and reduce the risk of cognitive decline. These aren't just trendy meals. Each of these is backed by science and tailored for aging minds. Stay until the end, because breakfast number 2 might surprise you with how simple and powerful it really is. Let's jump in. Number 8. Nutritional value of peanut butter plus banana on whole grain toast. One slice of whole grain bread provides roughly 305 grams of dietary fiber, which supports heart health and helps regulate blood sugar, a key concern in aging populations. A single medium banana offers about 105 calories, 422 mLp of potassium, 12% of the daily recommended intake, and 20% of the daily value for vitamin B6, an essential nutrient for neurotransmitter function and cognitive clarity. Natural peanut butter, about 2 tablespoons, contains 8 grams of protein, 16 grams of healthy fat, mostly monounsaturated, and 2 grams of fiber. It also offers vitamin E, magnesium, and niacin, vitamin B3, which together help maintain neural integrity and reduce oxidative stress in the brain. Research from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition suggests that vitamin E intake is associated with slower cognitive decline, particularly in older adults. One serving of peanut butter contains about 2.9 milligrams of vitamin E, which is 20% of the DV for adults. Moreover, this breakfast has a low glycemic index, GI, meaning it releases energy slowly and helps prevent insulin spikes. That's important because poor glucose regulation is a known risk factor for age cognitive impairment. The presence of fiber, fat, and protein also supports satiety, reducing overeating and assisting in healthy weight management, which is linked to better cardiovascular and brain health. However, individuals with peanut allergies, chronic kidney disease due to potassium in bananas, or those on low-fat diets for medical reasons should consult a healthcare provider before including this regularly in their diet. Opting for unsweetened, natural peanut butter and pairing with low-sodium whole grain bread is also recommended to maximize benefits and reduce hidden additives. Number 7. Nutritional value of boiled eggs plus avocado plus rye toast. One large boiled egg contains approximately 6 grams of high-quality protein, 70 calories, and 147 milligrams of choline, which is 27% of the recommended daily intake for adult women and 22% for men. Choline is essential for producing acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter vital for memory, learning, and muscle control. According to a 2020 study in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, higher choline intake is associated with better cognitive performance and a reduced risk of dementia. Avocados, on the other hand, offer a rich source of monounsaturated fats, particularly oleic acid, which helps maintain healthy blood flow to the brain. Just half an avocado provides around 117 calories, 10 grams of fat, 485 milligrams of potassium, 10% of DV, 20% DV of folate, and 15% DV of vitamin K. These nutrients work synergistically to reduce inflammation, support neural pathways, and regulate blood pressure, all critical for brain health and aging. Folate and vitamin K in particular have been linked to slower rates of cognitive decline in older populations. Rye bread, known for its low glycemic index, supports stable blood glucose levels and digestive health. One slice typically offers 2-3 grams of fiber and 15-20 grams of complex carbs, helping to fuel the brain without the sugar spikes that impair mental clarity. However, individuals with egg allergies, advanced kidney disease due to potassium in avocado, or those on low-fat or cholesterol-restricted diets should consult a physician before consuming this breakfast regularly. Choosing whole grain rye with no added sugar or sodium and limiting avocado to half per serving is recommended for balanced intake. Number 6. Nutritional value of whole grain waffles with crushed walnuts and raw honey. A single whole grain waffle provides approximately 120 to 150 calories, 3.4 grams of fiber, 12 to 16% of the daily value, and around 25 grams of complex carbohydrates, which help maintain stable glucose levels and provide sustained energy for the brain. For older adults, stabilizing blood sugar is vital, as spikes and crashes are linked to reduced cognitive performance and increased fatigue. Crushed walnuts are the nutritional powerhouse in this meal. Just 1 ounce, 28 g of walnuts delivers 2.5 g of alpha-linolenic acid, ALAA, a plant-based omega-3 fatty acid, 4 g of protein, 2 g of fiber, 45% of the DV for manganese, 19% DV for magnesium, and 12% DV for copper. According to a 2020 study in the Journal of Nutrition, Health, and Aging, regular walnut consumption in older adults was associated with better cognitive scores, including memory and attention, especially when paired with an overall healthy diet. Raw honey adds a natural touch of sweetness, supplying antioxidants like phenolic acids and flavonoids. A teaspoon contains 17 calories and no fat, but its value lies in its anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties. Research from oxidative medicine and cellular longevity suggests raw honey may help reduce oxidative stress, a contributing factor to age neurodegenerative diseases. However, individuals with nut allergies, diabetes, or those following a low-carb diet should be cautious. Raw honey, while natural, still contains sugars and can spike blood glucose if consumed in excess. A safe guideline is 1-2 teaspoons per serving, and opt for unsweetened, high-fiber waffles to keep this breakfast balanced. Number 5. Nutritional value of Greek yogurt with ground flaxseed and strawberries. A typical serving of plain, low-fat Greek yogurt, 170 g or tilde 6, contains 15-20 g of protein, 30-40% of the DV, 150 mg of calcium, 15% of the DV, 17% DV of vitamin B12, and 20% DV of phosphorus. These nutrients play crucial roles in preserving muscle mass, strengthening bones, and supporting the myelin sheath that protects brain cells. Vitamin B12 in particular is essential for memory and neurological function, a nutrient often deficient in adults over 50. Adding 1 tablespoon of ground flaxseed contributes about 2 g of fiber, 7% DV, 1.6 g of ALA omega-3, meeting 100% of the daily recommendation for ALA, 10% DV of magnesium, and lignans, phytoestrogens with antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects. Studies published in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience show that omega-3s like ALA are associated with slower cognitive decline and improved brain plasticity in aging populations. Topping with 1/2 cup of strawberries adds 50 milligrams of vitamin C over 50% DV. Antioxidants such as anthocyanins, which have been shown to reduce oxidative stress and neuroinflammation, key factors in Alzheimer's progression. A long-term study by Harvard University linked regular berry intake with a delay in cognitive aging by up to 2.5 years. However, those who are lactose intolerant, have estrogen-sensitive conditions, or are on low-fiber diets due to GI disorders should consult a healthcare provider. Opting for unsweetened yogurt and starting with 1 TSP of flaxseed, then gradually increasing is advised for sensitive digestive systems. Number 4. Nutritional value of green smoothie with spinach, banana, chia seeds, and almond milk. Spinach is one of the most potent leafy greens for cognitive health. 1 cup of raw spinach, 30 g, contains 145 micrograms of vitamin K, 121% of the daily value, 15% DV of lutein and zeaxanthin, powerful carotenoids that accumulate in the retina and brain. According to a 2018 study published in Neurology, higher intake of leafy greens was linked to slower cognitive decline, equivalent to 11 years of younger brain age. Bananas provide quick energy and important micronutrients. A medium banana offers 422 milligrams of potassium, 12% DV, 20% DV of vitamin B6, which supports neurotransmitter production, 3 grams of fiber for digestive health and blood sugar regulation. Chia seeds are small but mighty. Just 1 tablespoon, about 12 g, contains 5 grams of fiber, 18% DV, 2.5 g of alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, fulfilling 100% of the ALA omega-3 requirement, 10% DV of calcium, 15% DV of magnesium, and plant-based protein. ALA has been shown to reduce inflammation and promote neuroplasticity, which helps maintain learning and memory in older adults. Unsweetened almond milk, often fortified, contributes 30% DV of calcium, 25% DV of vitamin D, and is naturally low in calories and sugar, ideal for seniors managing weight or diabetes. However, individuals on blood thinners, e.g. warfarin, should consult a doctor due to the high vitamin K content in spinach. Additionally, those with low blood pressure or kidney issues should monitor potassium intake from bananas. Always choose unsweetened almond milk to avoid unnecessary sugar. Number 3. Nutritional value of whole grain toast with almond butter and blueberries. 1 slice of whole grain toast, about 30 g, delivers 305 g of dietary fiber, 12-20% of the daily value, 15-20 g of complex carbohydrates, and B vitamins such as niacin and thiamine, which support energy production and neurological function. Almond butter adds a powerful nutritional punch. Just 2 tablespoons provides 7 g of protein, 18 g of healthy fat, mostly monounsaturated, 25% of the daily value for vitamin E, 20% DV for magnesium, and 10% DV for calcium. Vitamin E is a potent antioxidant known for protecting neurons from oxidative damage. A 2020 study published in Nutrients found that higher vitamin E intake was associated with slower cognitive decline in elderly individuals. Magnesium, meanwhile, supports memory, nerve function, and mood regulation. Blueberries are one of the top-ranked fruits for brain health. A 1/2 cup serving offers 42 calories, 10% EV of vitamin C, high levels of anthocyanins, plant compounds shown to cross the blood-brain barrier and improve communication between brain cells. In a long-term Harvard Nurses' Health study involving over 16,000 participants, regular berry consumption was linked to delayed cognitive aging by up to 2.5 years. This breakfast checks all the right boxes for seniors. It's rich in healthy fats and fiber, low in added sugars, high in antioxidants, and supports stable blood glucose levels, a critical factor in maintaining brain health. However, individuals with nut allergies, caloric restrictions, or those taking blood thinners due to vitamin E should consult with their healthcare provider. Choose unsweetened almond butter and fresh or frozen wild blueberries for maximum nutritional benefit without added sugars or preservatives. Number 2. Nutritional value of steel-cut oats with almond milk, walnuts, and cinnamon. Steel-cut oats are less processed than rolled oats and have a lower glycemic index, which helps maintain steady blood sugar levels. A 1/2 cup cooked serving provides 4 grams of dietary fiber, 16% of DV, 5 grams of protein, 27 grams of complex carbohydrates, 10% DV of iron, and 18% DV of manganese, which plays a role in brain function and enzyme activation. Soluble fiber, particularly beta-glucan, found in oats, has been linked to improved cholesterol levels and enhanced blood flow to the brain. According to a 2016 study in the British Journal of Nutrition, regular oat consumption may reduce LDL cholesterol by up to 10%, thereby decreasing stroke and cognitive impairment risk. Almond milk, unsweetened, fortified, adds 30% DV of calcium, 25% DV of vitamin D, low calories and no saturated fat, ideal for aging hearts and bones. Walnuts, 1 ounce or 28 Gs, contribute 2.5 grams of alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, meeting 100% of the daily ALA omega-3 requirement. 4 grams of protein, 2 grams of fiber, 44% DV of manganese, and 11% DV of magnesium. A 2020 study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that consistent walnut intake was associated with improved memory and cognitive performance in older adults. Cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon, adds antioxidants and may help enhance brain function and regulate blood sugar, especially in older individuals at risk for type 2 diabetes. This breakfast meets key criteria for seniors: heart-healthy, brain-supportive, low in sugar, and high in fiber and omega-3s. However, individuals with nut allergies, those on low-fiber diets due to gastrointestinal conditions, or taking blood thinners should use caution, especially with high manganese intake from walnuts. Always choose unsweetened almond milk and limit cinnamon to moderate amounts to avoid liver strain from excessive coumarin. Number 1. Nutritional value of warm green tea with oat bar and roasted pumpkin seeds. Green tea, especially varieties like matcha or sencha, is rich in epigallocatine gallate, EGCG, a powerful antioxidant known to cross the blood-brain barrier and reduce inflammation in neural tissues. 1 cup 240 milligrams of brewed green tea provides 230 milligrams of catechins, 30-50 milligrams of caffeine, L-theanine, an amino acid that promotes calm focus without drowsiness. A 2020 study in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience highlighted that older adults who drank green tea daily had significantly better working memory and attention scores compared to non-tea drinkers. A whole grain oat bar, typically tilled 40G, contributes 405 grams of dietary fiber, 16-20% DV, 20-25 G of complex carbohydrates, 406 G of protein, and B vitamins like niacin and B6, supporting nerve signaling and energy metabolism. Fiber from oats, especially beta-glucan, helps lower dementia risk and promotes steady glucose levels, both linked to lower dementia risk. Roasted pumpkin seeds, pepitas, 1 ounce, 28 G, adds 7 G of protein, 2 G of fiber, 40% DV of magnesium, 20% DV of zinc, 15% DV of iron, tryptophan, a precursor to serotonin and melatonin, supporting mood and sleep. Magnesium plays a key role in memory and cognition, while zinc supports synaptic plasticity, essential for learning and neuroprotection. However, individuals with iron overload, hemochromatosis, caffeine sensitivity, or kidney disorders due to high magnesium and potassium levels in seeds should consume with caution. Always choose unsweetened green tea and opt for low-sodium dry-roasted pumpkin seeds to avoid excess salt intake. Taking care of your brain starts with simple choices, and breakfast is one of the most powerful. These 8 meals aren't just delicious, they're backed by science to help protect your memory, boost focus, and support healthy aging. If you're over 50, it's never too late to eat smarter and feel sharper. What's your go-to brain-boosting breakfast? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more healthy tips.